The old man paused before answering. His hands were shaking slightly as he stared at the faded black and white photograph lying on the table. In the picture, dusty American tanks rolled through a French town under a gray summer sky, while civilians ran beside them, waving and crying at the same time. The veteran looked at the image for several seconds before speaking again. Then, very quietly, he said something that many soldiers who fought in France in 1944 would later repeat for the rest of their lives. He said Patton's army did not feel like an army anymore. It felt like weather. Fast, loud, impossible to stop. And somewhere far behind those tanks, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was hearing reports so unbelievable that even experienced officers thought there had to be a mistake on the maps. August 1944 was supposed to be difficult for the Allies. The fighting in Normandy had already cost thousands of lives. The beaches were behind them, but France itself was still dangerous. German forces were retreating, yet they remained deadly. Roads were damaged. Fuel was limited. Supply lines stretched farther every day. Most Allied commanders believed the advance across France would slow down, sooner or later. Armies could not move endlessly without rest, food, ammunition, and gasoline. At least that was what military logic said. But General George S. Patton did not think like most commanders. By the middle of August, Patton's Third Army had already exploded across western France with terrifying speed. His tanks moved day and night. His drivers slept beside engines, while mechanics repaired vehicles in open fields under weak flashlight beams. American soldiers barely had time to understand where they were before they were ordered forward again. Some units advanced so quickly that maps became useless within hours. French civilians watched columns of Sherman tanks roar through villages faster than anyone thought possible. Dust clouds covered entire roads. Engines screamed through the night. Soldiers ate while moving. Officers stopped asking how far they were supposed to go and started asking whether there was anyone left ahead of them. You can almost feel the strange energy of that moment. Europe had been trapped under war for years. Then suddenly this American army was racing through France so fast that even Allied headquarters struggled to keep track of it. German units that expected organized attacks instead found American armor appearing miles behind their planned defenses. Entire sections of the German command structure began collapsing under confusion. Telephone lines were cut. Retreat routes vanished overnight. Some German officers later admitted they believed multiple American armies were advancing at once, because no single force should have been able to move that quickly. Patton encouraged the chaos. He believed speed itself was a weapon. He once told officers that a good plan violently executed now was better than a perfect plan next week. In France, he was putting that belief into action every hour. His headquarters constantly moved forward. Staff officers sometimes woke up, unsure which town they were in. Drivers crashed from exhaustion. Fuel trucks raced behind tank columns like blood, trying to keep a giant creature alive. At the same time, hundreds of miles away from the front edge of Patton's advance, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery studied maps with growing concern. Montgomery was not reckless. He believed in careful preparation, organized planning, and controlled offensives. During the Normandy campaign, he had played a major role in holding the Allied front together during brutal fighting around Caen. British troops under his command had suffered heavily. Montgomery respected discipline above all else. To him, wars were won through steady pressure and coordination, not wild movement. And now George Patton was crossing France like a man trying to outrun history itself. The tension between the two commanders had existed for months. They were completely different men. Montgomery was cold, controlled, and precise. Patton was emotional, aggressive, and explosive. Montgomery carefully studied battles before committing forces. Patton often trusted instinct and momentum. British officers sometimes viewed Patton as dangerously reckless. Many American officers viewed Montgomery as painfully slow. Their rivalry was not only personal. It represented two completely different ideas of warfare. But even Montgomery could not ignore results. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Across France, German resistance began breaking apart faster than Allied planners expected. Patton saw opportunity everywhere. Instead of slowing down, he pushed harder. His forces crossed rivers before bridges were secure. Recon units drove deep into territory without waiting for infantry support. Communication with higher command became increasingly difficult because Third Army units were moving too fast for normal coordination. One American officer later described the situation perfectly. He said Patton was no longer advancing according to orders. The orders were trying desperately to catch up with Patton. The deeper Third Army pushed into France, the more dangerous the situation became. Fuel shortages grew severe. Some tank crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned vehicles. Supply officers warned headquarters that the advance could collapse completely if the army outran its logistics. Yet Patton continued demanding movement. He believed stopping was more dangerous than pushing forward. Every pause gave the Germans time to reorganize. German commanders were stunned by the speed of the Allied breakthrough. Only weeks earlier, they had expected Normandy to become another long defensive battle. Now, American armored columns were cutting through France so rapidly that retreating German units sometimes encountered American forces in places they believed were still secure. Reports reaching Berlin became increasingly desperate. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz later admitted German units often felt like they were fighting smoke. By the time defenses were prepared, Patton's forces had already moved beyond them. The weather during those weeks added to the strange atmosphere. Summer heat covered the roads. Dust filled the air behind endless convoys. French towns echoed with engine noise day and night. Burned German vehicles lined highways beside abandoned equipment. Civilians flooded roads trying to greet Allied soldiers while military police struggled to keep routes open. And still Patton pushed east. By late August, the scale of the advance became shocking even by Allied standards. Third Army had traveled hundreds of miles across France in a matter of days. Some units moved so quickly they captured German officers still eating breakfast. Others entered towns before local resistance fighters realized Allied forces were nearby. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, officers began debating strategy more aggressively. Supply limitations made it impossible to fully support every advancing army at maximum speed. Someone would eventually have to slow down. Eisenhower faced enormous pressure trying to balance competing commanders and limited resources. Montgomery argued for concentrated attacks with organized supply support. Patton argued for relentless pursuit. Both men believed they understood how to finish the war faster. Both believed their strategy was correct. But Patton's actions in France created a problem nobody could ignore anymore. He was succeeding. That success made everything more complicated. Montgomery watched the reports carefully. Intelligence officers tracked the movement of American forces across France with growing disbelief. Distances that should have taken weeks were being covered in days. German resistance was collapsing in sectors where Patton appeared. Entire enemy formations were being trapped or scattered before they could reorganize. Yet Montgomery remained cautious about what it all meant. He understood something many younger officers did not. Fast advances could become disasters very quickly. Armies that moved too far ahead of support could be isolated and destroyed. Fuel shortages could stop tanks in open country. German counterattacks were still dangerous. The Wehrmacht was wounded, not dead. And there was another uncomfortable truth beneath everything else. Patton's advance was capturing attention across the Allied world. Newspapers loved him. Soldiers admired him. Civilians cheered him. Photographs of Third Army racing through France appeared everywhere. The image was powerful. American tanks moving endlessly eastward while German forces collapsed before them. For Montgomery, who had spent years building his reputation carefully through discipline and planning, Patton represented something deeply frustrating. Chaos that somehow worked. Early September brought even more confusion inside Allied command. Patton's spearheads continued advancing toward the German border. Maps inside headquarters changed constantly. Officers struggled to understand where front lines actually existed because movement was happening too quickly. Then came one of the most astonishing realities of the campaign. Patton had crossed roughly 400 miles of France with a level of speed and freedom that many officers considered almost beyond normal command control. His forces were often operating ahead of detailed instructions. Opportunities were seized immediately, rather than waiting for approval through long communication chains. To some commanders, it looked brilliant. To others, it looked insane. Montgomery reportedly studied the situation with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. British officers around him understood exactly what made the situation so unusual. Military operations on that scale were supposed to require strict coordination, yet Patton's army seemed powered partly by momentum itself. Every success created another opening. Every opening encouraged another push. The deeper story was not simply about one general moving quickly. It was about two visions of warfare colliding during one of the most important moments of World War II. Montgomery believed wars were won by reducing risk carefully. Patton believed wars were won by attacking faster than the enemy could think. And across France in 1944, Patton's theory suddenly looked terrifyingly effective. American soldiers inside Third Army later remembered those weeks almost like a blur. Convoys stretched endlessly along roads. Sleep became rare. Engines overheated constantly. Men shaved beside moving vehicles. Some tank crews fought multiple engagements within the same day while barely understanding where they were geographically. Yet morale remained incredibly high. Many soldiers sensed they were witnessing something historic. German forces were retreating almost everywhere. French civilians celebrated liberation with emotional scenes that troops never forgot. Villages erupted with cheering crowds. Church bells rang wildly as American columns entered town after town. But danger remained close. German resistance still appeared suddenly in forests, crossroads, and river positions. Ambushes destroyed vehicles without warning. Snipers hid inside ruined buildings. Luftwaffe aircraft occasionally attacked roads crowded with Allied traffic. Patton's speed reduced German reaction time, but it also exposed his own troops constantly. Near Nancy and Metz, resistance stiffened sharply. German forces defending approaches toward the Reich fought harder as the distance to Germany itself shrank. The easy momentum of August began slowing under supply shortages and stronger defenses. Still, the legend of the Great Drive across France had already been created. Somewhere inside British headquarters, Montgomery reportedly reacted to Patton's achievement with a comment that carried both criticism and reluctant admiration. Different versions of the quote survived over the years, but the meaning remained similar. Montgomery essentially acknowledged that Patton had crossed France with extraordinary speed, while behaving in ways that ignored the careful methods most commanders depended upon. For Montgomery, this was not simple praise, it was closer to professional disbelief. He understood exactly how dangerous such movement could have become. He also understood how few commanders on Earth would even attempt it. That was what made Patton so difficult to deal with. He regularly succeeded in situations where military logic suggested he should fail. The rivalry between the two generals continued long after France. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Montgomery received priority for supplies in support of his ambitious airborne offensive into the Netherlands. Patton was furious. He believed German forces were collapsing and that aggressive attacks elsewhere could break into Germany faster. Montgomery believed Market Garden could end the war early through a concentrated strike. Both men criticized each other privately. Both believed the other misunderstood strategy. Eisenhower spent enormous energy balancing their personalities while trying to maintain Allied unity. Yet despite all arguments, there remained a strange respect beneath the rivalry. Montgomery did not admire recklessness, but he respected effectiveness. And Patton's drive across France had been undeniably effective. Military historians later spent decades studying those weeks. Some argued Patton missed opportunities by advancing too broadly. Others argued fuel shortages alone prevented him from reaching Germany far earlier. Many agreed on one point: the speed of Third Army's advance shocked nearly everyone involved, including Allied leadership. The numbers alone seemed unbelievable. Hundreds of miles crossed in days. Thousands of German prisoners captured. Entire regions liberated rapidly. Supply lines stretched to the limit while armored spearheads continued moving eastward. Modern audiences sometimes forget how emotionally overwhelming that period felt in 1944. Europe had suffered under occupation and war for years. Suddenly there was movement everywhere. Liberation. Collapse. Retreat. Pursuit. The future of the continent seemed to change almost daily. Patton became one of the faces of that movement, and Montgomery became one of the men forced to measure it carefully. Years later, officers who served under Montgomery admitted he often became frustrated by how public attention focused on dramatic offensives rather than methodical planning. He believed newspapers and politicians sometimes misunderstood warfare entirely. Fast advances created excitement. Careful logistics created victory. To Montgomery, both mattered, but only one usually received headlines. Patton understood publicity naturally. He wore ivory-handled pistols. He delivered emotional speeches. He projected confidence constantly. Even his movements across France felt theatrical to observers. But behind the image stood genuine military aggression that terrified German commanders. Intercepted reports from retreating German formations revealed widespread confusion during August and September 1944. Units frequently lost contact with neighboring formations. Defensive lines disappeared before they could stabilize. American armored columns attacked road networks aggressively, disrupting retreat patterns. Some German officers believed Allied forces possessed far greater numbers than they actually did, because Patton's mobility created the illusion of overwhelming presence. That illusion mattered. War often depends as much on psychology as firepower. Patton understood fear. He understood momentum. He believed hesitation killed opportunity. Montgomery understood endurance. He understood organization. He believed reckless victories could become strategic disasters later. Neither man was completely right. Neither man was completely wrong. That complexity is what makes the story so fascinating, even decades later. The famous advance across France was not a simple heroic charge. It was a dangerous gamble balanced on fuel shortages, exhausted crews, broken roads, and collapsing German command structures. If the Germans had reorganized faster, Third Army might have faced catastrophe. If supplies had failed completely, armored spearheads could have stalled exposed deep inside hostile territory. Instead, Patton's gamble became legend. And Montgomery was left studying the results with the uncomfortable awareness that this reckless American general had just achieved something extraordinary. The emotional weight of that moment stayed with many veterans long after the war ended. Tank drivers remembered endless roads disappearing under tracks. Infantrymen remembered sleeping beside highways while convoys thundered past through darkness. Civilians remembered hearing Allied engines before seeing them. German survivors remembered confusion more than anything else. Everything moved too fast. That speed became the defining memory of Patton's campaign across France. Even now, historians continue debating whether the advance could have ended the war sooner if Allied strategy had concentrated differently afterward. Some argue Patton should have received greater supply priority. Others believe Montgomery's caution prevented disastrous overextension. The arguments never fully disappear because both commanders represented genuine strengths and genuine weaknesses. But one fact remains impossible to ignore. In the summer of 1944, George Patton crossed France with a speed that stunned allies and enemies alike. And somewhere inside Allied headquarters, Bernard Montgomery looked at the maps, listened to the reports, and realized that military history had just witnessed something rare. Not simply an advance, not simply a victory, but one of those moments when war stops behaving according to normal expectations. The old veteran at the table finally leaned back in his chair and looked again at the faded photograph. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. Then, he spoke one final time about Patton's drive across France. He said the strange thing was not how fast the tanks moved. It was how everyone else suddenly felt slow.